Jake Thompson sat in the cold metal chair of Commander Patterson's office, tapping his fingers against his thigh. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, casting everything in that sterile white glow that always made him feel like he was being interrogated. Outside the window, massive starships floated silently in the docking bay, giants of steel and technology waiting to carry humanity deeper into space. Commander Patterson was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen more alien worlds than most people had seen continents. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We're sending you to Velthor territory," she said, sliding a holographic file across her desk. "It's a diplomatic mission. High stakes. The Coalition needs someone who can talk their language and understand their tech. You're the best engineer we've got for this." Jake nodded. He'd been expecting something like this. His reputation in the engineering division was solid. He could fix anything, could think through problems that would make other engineers' heads explode. But there was something in Patterson's tone that made him sit up straighter. "Here's the complication," Patterson continued. "The Velthor, they're not like us. They don't just value individual skill. They value relationships, social bonds. Their whole culture is built on it. When you show up to negotiate, you can't show up alone. They'll see it as weakness. They'll think you don't have allies, don't have value in your own community." Jake felt his stomach drop a little. He was good with machines. People? Not his strongest area. "You need to bring someone with you," Patterson said. "A companion. Someone close to you. It doesn't have to be romantic or anything formal like that. Just someone. Anyone. Proof that you matter to somebody. That's how they read these things. It's not just about treaties and technology with the Velthor. It's about whether you're the kind of person worth trusting." Jake ran his hand through his hair. This was a problem. A real problem. His best friend was deployed on another station. His family was scattered across 3 planets. Most of his colleagues were either too junior to bring on a diplomatic mission or too senior to leave their posts. He barely went to social functions. The few people he could call friends were, well, acquaintances was more accurate. "How long do I have?" he asked. Patterson checked her display. "Ship leaves in 3 hours. You'll arrive at the Coalition station in Velthor space in 5 days. They're expecting you. 3 hours." Jake's mind was already spinning through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Call an ex-girlfriend? Terrible idea. Hire someone? Insulting and obvious. Convince a coworker to drop everything? Unlikely and dishonest. He stood up, thanked Patterson, and walked out of the office in a daze. The drive to the sanctuary took 40 minutes through traffic. The sanctuary was a research facility about 20 kilometers outside the main city, a massive compound with reinforced walls and controlled environments. It housed rescued alien creatures, animals that had been captured illegally or abandoned by their handlers. Some were dangerous. Some were just rare and in need of protection. A few were species people thought were long extinct. Jake had been there once before on a school trip as a kid. He still remembered the wonder of seeing creatures that shouldn't exist outside of science fiction movies. As he walked through the corridors now, his shoes squeaking against polished floors, he felt the weight of his impossible situation pressing down on him. 3 hours. He needed a companion. Someone who could sit through a diplomatic mission and convince hostile aliens that Jake Thompson was a person worth dealing with. That's when he turned a corner and saw the enclosure. The dragon was small, barely bigger than a house cat. Her scales caught the light and threw it back in waves of emerald green and deep gold, like she was made of living precious metals. She was curled up in the corner of her habitat, one tiny wing folded against her body. The nameplate on the glass read, Ember. Species, Drakeling. Status, presumed extinct. Rescued from illegal collection 14 months ago. Jake stopped walking. The dragon lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that seemed impossibly intelligent. She didn't look mean or aggressive. She looked lonely. She looked like she understood exactly what it was like to be the only one of your kind, to be valuable to everyone but belonging to no one. Jake pressed his hand against the cool glass. "Hey there, Ember." The dragon stood up and padded over to the glass where his hand was. She was small enough that her whole head barely covered his palm on the other side. She blinked slowly, a gesture that meant trust in most sentient species' body language. Without really thinking it through, without considering the 1,000 ways this could go wrong, Jake found himself walking to the administrative office. He filled out paperwork for a temporary adoption, something that was usually a month-long process but which a sympathetic administrator agreed to rush through when Jake explained it was for an important mission. Within 30 minutes, he had Ember's release paperwork and a temporary containment unit, a small climate-controlled box with soft bedding and access ports. He carried the sleeping dragon to his vehicle, placed the box carefully in the back seat, and drove toward the spaceport. No one would notice, he told himself. He hoped. The docking bay of the Coalition station was massive, a cavern of metal and machinery that could swallow a city block. Jake stood near the landing platform with his hands sweating, Ember's containment unit resting on a cart beside him. The dragon inside was awake now, her small nose pressed against the transparent panel, curious about the new environment. Jake had spent the 5-day journey trying to figure out what the hell he was going to say when Commander Kresh arrived. He'd come up with 100 different introductions and rejected every single one. Nothing made sense. Nothing would make this situation less ridiculous. The Velthor ship descended slowly, its massive engines creating a wind that made Jake's hair whip around his face. He steadied himself, trying to look professional and confident, like he wasn't about to blow a major diplomatic mission before it even started. The landing ramp hissed open. Commander Kresh came first. He was tall, easily 7 feet, with a frame that looked like it was built from angles and sharp edges. His skin was a deep blue-gray, almost metallic in the station's fluorescent lighting. His face had high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and eyes that were entirely black except for a thin ring of silver around the pupil. Everything about him screamed authority and control. He moved like a soldier who had spent his entire life winning fights. Behind him came 8 other Velthor officers, all dressed in the same sleek tactical uniform, all carrying themselves with the same rigid posture. They looked less like diplomats and more like a military inspection team. Kresh's eyes swept across the docking bay, and Jake watched them land on him. He saw the moment the commander expected to see someone important, a high-ranking diplomat, someone with medals and experience and the kind of bearing that commanded respect. Jake watched those black eyes process what they were actually seeing. A human in his 30s, dressed in a standard Coalition engineer's uniform, standing next to a small cargo container. Kresh's face didn't change, but something about his posture shifted. A ripple of tension moved through his delegation. Thompson? Kresh's voice came through the universal translator, which rendered it in perfect English but with an odd, clipped accent. You are the human representative? Commander Kresh, Jake said, extending his hand in the human greeting gesture. It's an honor to meet you. I'm Jake Thompson and this is... He turned to the cart and opened the containment unit. Ember emerged slowly, blinking in the bright light. She was smaller than she'd seemed in the sanctuary, somehow even more delicate now. Her scales shimmered in that distinctive way of hers, catching the light and throwing it back in waves of green and gold. She looked around the enormous docking bay with wide, curious eyes. The entire Velthor delegation went very still. This is your companion? Kresh asked. His translator made the words sound flat, but underneath them, Jake could hear something that sounded a lot like disdain. Like barely controlled anger. You bring this creature to represent human culture? One of the officers, a massive Velthor with scars across his face, took a step back and pulled a weapon halfway out of its holster. It wasn't quite drawn, but the message was clear. Something here was wrong. Something here was a threat. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. Yes, sir. This is Ember. She's an extinct species, Kresh interrupted, his voice growing colder. The Drakeling. Thought lost to the void 3,000 years ago. He took a step closer to Jake, and the human had to resist the urge to back away. You insult us with a pet, Thompson. You come to negotiate for your species, to discuss trade and technology and alliance, and you bring us a pet. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Another officer, younger than the others, made a sound that might have been disagreement. But he stayed silent, clearly bound by protocol. Jake felt sweat running down his temple. This was it. This was the moment where everything fell apart. His career, the mission, the chance for humanity to establish real relations with one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. All of it was about to collapse because he'd made an impulsive decision in a desperation. Then Ember yawned. It was a small thing, just a creature tired from travel, stretching her jaw open and letting out a sound like wind chimes. As she did, a small puff of smoke came out, harmless and warm-colored. The smoke hung in the air for a moment before dissipating, shimmering slightly as it faded. The young Velthor officer stepped forward slightly, his black eyes fixed on the dragon. Sir, he said quietly, breaking protocol but unable to stop himself. Look. Kresh's attention was still on Jake, still radiating that cold fury, but something made him glance back at Ember. The dragon's eyes had changed color. Jake wasn't sure if it was a natural ability or some kind of instinctive response, but Ember's eyes now reflected the emotional state of everyone looking at her. For Kresh, whose anger and suspicion filled the space like a physical presence, her eyes had turned a deep red-orange, almost like flame. For the scared officer with the weapon half-drawn, they'd taken on a nervous yellow-gold. For the curious young officer stepping forward, they'd shifted to a soft blue. It was like she was a living mirror showing everyone exactly how she perceived them. The docking bay fell completely silent. Even the ambient hum of machinery seemed to fade. Kresh stared at the dragon for what felt like an eternity. His hands slowly lowered. His jaw, which had been clenched so tight Jake could see the muscles working under his scaled skin, relaxed slightly. "We will," Kresh said finally, his voice different now, less certain, more measured. "We will discuss this further." He turned away from Jake without another word and walked back toward his delegation, his officers falling into line behind him. The young officer paused as he passed Jake, and for just a moment, the human saw something that might have been the hint of a smile. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Somehow, he just made the most important first impression of his life without saying a single word that mattered. The alarm started at 0400 hours. Jake was in his quarters, finally getting some sleep after 2 days of awkward silences and tense meetings with Kresh's delegation, when the sound cut through everything. It wasn't the normal alert system. This was the deep, resonant wail that meant catastrophic failure. The kind of alarm that made your body understand on a primal level that something was very wrong. He bolted out of bed and pulled on his uniform, his mind already racing through possibilities. A reactor malfunction would be bad. A reactor malfunction on a coalition station orbiting hostile territory would be catastrophic. If the station lost power, the shields would fail. If the shields failed, they'd be sitting ducks for any ship that wanted to attack. Ember was already awake, her small form alert and tense, her scales flickering through anxious shades of yellow and orange. The corridors were chaos. Engineers ran past him, moving in organized panic toward the engineering section. He grabbed one of them, a young human woman with her dark hair tied back in a quick knot. "What happened?" Jake shouted over the continuing alarm. "Reactor cores showing critical fluctuations," she yelled back. "The Velthor team's been working on it for 3 hours. They can't isolate the source. Chief says it's beyond their capabilities. They're calling for human engineering support." Jake nodded and kept moving. He didn't ask why the Velthor, who were supposed to be the more advanced civilization, were calling for human help. In that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was that something needed fixing, and he was one of the few people on this station who might be able to do it. The engineering section was a massive chamber filled with massive machines. The reactor core sat at the center, a cylindrical structure the size of a small building, covered in panels and conduits and monitoring systems that blinked with angry red warnings. The Velthor engineers were everywhere, their blue-gray skin slick with sweat, their movements jerky and frustrated. They were used to being the smartest people in any room. They were not used to failure. Commander Kresh stood to the side watching. When he saw Jake enter, he moved to intercept him. "Thompson." The commander's black eyes were harder than before, colder. "I need you to understand something. This station is critical to coalition operations. If this reactor fails, the entire platform becomes unstable. We have maybe 2 hours before the core reaches a cascading failure point. At that point, nothing can save this station or the people on it." Jake felt the weight of that statement settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. "The Velthor are advanced engineers," Kresh continued. "We have studied technology for millennia. And we cannot find the source of this malfunction. Your species is supposed to be innovative, creative in ways we are not. Prove it, Thompson. Fix this reactor. Or we void this partnership, and you can explain to your government why you brought us a pet instead of a diplomat." There was no anger in Kresh's voice anymore. Just cold certainty. Failure wasn't an option. Jake nodded and moved to the monitoring station. He pulled up the schematics on the main display, a three-dimensional rendering of the entire reactor system, color-coded and annotated with thousands of data points. The Velthor had marked 3 different areas where they suspected problems, but the sensor data kept contradicting those assessments. He studied the readings for 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. Something was wrong. Not with the reactor, with the data itself. The sensor readings didn't match the physical layout. It was like the system was lying to him or telling him part of the truth while hiding another part. He'd encountered this kind of problem before in old Earth machinery. Sometimes the problem wasn't where the instrument said it was. Sometimes it was somewhere nobody was looking. He turned to ask one of the Velthor engineers a question about the sensor configuration, and that's when he noticed Ember. The dragon had followed him into the engineering section. She must have slipped past the guards when they were distracted. She was small enough to navigate the space without drawing attention, and her natural curiosity seemed to override any sense of danger. She was walking slowly through the chamber, her head lifted, her eyes beginning to glow that distinctive amber color that meant she was sensing something. Most people would have sent her away. But Jake had learned something in the past 2 days. Ember wasn't a pet. She was something more than that. Her perception worked differently than human instruments. She saw things in ways that technology couldn't measure. He watched as the dragon moved deeper into the chamber, weaving between massive machines, her eyes growing brighter and more intense. Then she stopped. She was standing in front of a support column, one of the massive structural elements that held up the entire reactor assembly. Behind it was a panel, flush with the wall, completely hidden from casual observation. No human instruments had flagged it. No Velthor engineer had thought to check there. Ember's eyes were burning a bright, intense amber now. She was staring at that panel like it was the most important thing in the universe. Jake moved fast. He pushed aside some equipment and reached the panel. It was stuck. Old, corroded, sealed by years of oxidation and disuse. He had to use a tool to pry it open, metal screaming against metal until finally it gave way. Inside he found it. A crystalline conductor, the kind used to channel power through older reactor designs. It was covered in corrosion, deep, pitted damage that would have been invisible to standard sensors. The crystal was barely holding together, its structure compromised by decay and time. It was like the heart of the system was rotting from the inside out, and all the sensors in the world wouldn't have caught it because they weren't designed to look in a place this obscure. There, Jake breathed. He looked back at Ember, and the dragon's eyes had shifted back to their normal state. She blinked at him, calm now, like she'd just done the most natural thing in the world. Jake pulled the corroded conductor out carefully and called over his shoulder, "Get me a replacement crystalline matrix. Class A if you have it. And I need a technician who knows the old coupling systems." The next 50 minutes were a blur of activity. Jake worked with methodical precision, removing the damaged conductor, installing the new one, recalibrating the entire power distribution system. Every step was critical. Every movement had to be perfect. One mistake and they'd be right back where they started. But there were no mistakes. The new conductor hummed to life, and the reactor responded. The angry red warnings on the display began shifting to yellow, then orange, then finally, to the calm, steady green of normal operation. The alarm cut off. The station's engines, which had been struggling and shuddering, smoothed out into their normal rhythm. Jake ran the diagnostics twice to be absolutely sure, checking every system, verifying every reading. Everything came back normal. He turned to find Kresh standing right behind him. The commander's expression was difficult to read. His black eyes were fixed on Ember, who had climbed onto a piece of equipment and was grooming her small wings with complete indifference to the chaos she'd just helped resolve. "The dragon," Kresh said slowly. His voice carried a tone Jake hadn't heard from the Velthor before. It sounded almost like wonder. "She found what our instruments missed. Our sensors, our technology, our centuries of advancement, and it was a creature you called a pet who located the problem." Jake looked at Ember, then back at Kresh. "She found it. I fixed it. We did this together." Kresh was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a subtle relaxation of the tension that had been holding his features tight. His mouth curved upward at the corners just slightly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was close. "Together," Kresh repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like he was agreeing to something much larger than just fixing a reactor. The distress call came through at 0300 hours, cutting through the quiet hum of the station's night shift like a knife. Jake was in his quarters, finally getting some real sleep for the first time since arriving at the Coalition station. Ember was curled up on the foot of his bed, her scales dimmed to a soft green that meant she was deeply asleep. The past 3 days had been exhausting. The reactor repair had turned Jake into something of a hero among both the human and Velthor crews, but that kind of attention came with its own kind of pressure. The emergency signal cut through everything. Not an alarm this time, something different. An automated distress call, the kind that only went out when communication systems detected a threat. Jake was out of bed and moving before his brain fully caught up with what was happening. Ember jolted awake, her scales flickering through confused yellows and grays. He grabbed her gently and headed for the command center, moving through corridors that were already filling with personnel rushing to their stations. The command center was controlled chaos. Officers moved with purpose, tracking data streams and sensor feeds. Commander Kresh stood at the center of it all, his massive frame somehow seeming even larger under the weight of command. When he saw Jake enter, he gestured him over to the main tactical display. "Look at this," Kresh said, pulling up a series of intercepted communications. The display showed energy signatures, ship trajectories, and sensor readings, all of it painting a picture that made Jake's stomach tighten. A Krillian battle fleet. 17 capital ships, moving into our sector at maximum speed. They'll be in firing range in less than an hour. Jake studied the data. The Krillians? I thought they were supposed to be neutral. What do they want? Intelligence, Kresh said, and his voice was different now, harder, colder. We intercepted their communications. They know about Ember. They know that the Drakeling species has been rediscovered. Do you understand what that means? Jake shook his head slowly, though something in his gut was already telling him this wasn't going to be good news. Drakeling DNA, Kresh continued, his black eyes intense. It's the most valuable genetic material in the known galaxy. Their physiology allows them to sense and manipulate energy in ways nothing else can. Creatures like Ember don't just survive in hostile environments, they thrive in them. Their biology is adaptive in ways that make them perfect for biological weapons development. A weaponized Drakeling, or even just Drakeling genetic material, would give whoever possesses it military supremacy. The words hung in the air between them. They're coming for her, Jake said quietly. Yes, Kresh replied. And they're not interested in negotiation. The first volley hit before anyone could respond. The station shuddered violently, a physical jolt that knocked people to their knees. Red emergency lights flickered to life throughout the command center. The shields were holding, for now, but energy readings spiked across every display as the Krillian weapons fire pounded against the protective barrier. Status report. Kresh shouted. Shields at 78% and dropping, someone called out. We're taking sustained fire from multiple vectors. They're trying to overwhelm the shield grid in sections. More impacts. The station bucked like a living thing. One of the displays on the wall cracked from the vibration. Jake's mind was already working, already calculating. He wasn't a military strategist. He wasn't a weapons expert. But he was an engineer, and engineers solve problems. The shields were good, but they were designed for defense against standard weapons. The Krillians were using a coordinated attack pattern, concentrating fire on specific areas to try to punch through at a weak point. It was tactically smart, but it meant the power demand was unevenly distributed. Reroute power from the auxiliary systems to the forward shields, Jake said, his words coming fast. Reduce power to non-critical systems. Life support, medical, the habitation modules, they won't matter if the station blows up anyway. Everything goes to the main shield grid. Kresh was already relaying the orders before Jake finished speaking. The commander trusted him. That was new. That was significant. But there was more. Jake could feel it. Shields and rerouted power could buy them time, but time wasn't the same as survival. The Krillians had 17 capital ships. The coalition station had defensive weapons, but they weren't designed to hold off a military fleet. Get Ember to the resonance chamber, Jake said urgently. Now. The main power core chamber where we found the corroded conductor. I need her there. Kresh looked at him like he'd gone insane. That chamber is structurally exposed. She'll be exactly where she needs to be, Jake finished. Trust me. Please. Another impact. Alarm screamed. Kresh made a decision. He signaled to one of his officers, a younger Velthor with sharp features and quick movements. Take the Drakeling to the resonance chamber. No. And Thompson, if this doesn't work. It'll work, Jake said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. He didn't wait to see if they took Ember. He moved to the engineering station and started pulling up the station's defense grid schematics. The resonance chamber was the heart of the power distribution system. It was where the station's energy flowed through in concentrated waves. Most creatures would be destroyed in there. But Ember wasn't most creatures. The Krillian ships closed in. More fire. The shields flickered, straining under the assault. Jake could see the energy readings on his display. The shields were holding at 60%, but the power demand was climbing exponentially. Then something changed. A sound filled the command center, or maybe it filled the entire station. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense, but it was present. It was like crystalline bells layering over deep bass frequencies, a harmony that seemed to resonate in Jake's bones. The sound was coming from the resonance chamber, amplified through the station's power distribution system, and it was like nothing Jake had ever heard before. Ember was singing. On every display in the command center, the energy readings suddenly synchronized. The chaotic, scattered power distribution suddenly became unified, focused, intentional. It was like the dragon's voice had given the station's defenses a consciousness they'd never had before. The shield grid stopped being a passive barrier and became an active, responsive system that anticipated the Krillian weapon's fire and adjusted for it in real time. The next volley of energy fire from the Krillian fleet hit the shields and bounced off like rain hitting glass. The shield flared brilliant white, almost blinding in its intensity. Then silence. The Krillian ships stopped firing. Jake watched the tactical display as their formation broke. They began withdrawing, their ships turning and accelerating away from the station at maximum speed. Within minutes, the threat display showed them leaving the sector entirely. "They're retreating," someone whispered in the command center. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached over and shut down the emergency protocols, bringing the station back to its normal operational state. Kresh was standing beside him, his massive frame still and silent. When Jake looked at the commander, he saw something unexpected in those black eyes. Not just relief. Something that looked almost like awe. "What did she do?" Kresh asked quietly. "She harmonized with the system," Jake said slowly, working through the data scrolling across his display. Her resonance frequency matched the station's power grid. She didn't just sing, she became part of the defenses. Every weapon the Krillians fired, the shields adapted to it in real time because they had Ember's instinctive understanding of energy patterns. "She made us stronger." Kresh was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and headed toward the resonance chamber. Jake followed. When they arrived, Ember was lying on the floor, exhausted. Her scales were a pale gray, drained of their normal vibrant colors. She'd given everything she had to protect the station. Jake knelt beside her, and the dragon raised her head slightly. Her eyes found his, and even in her exhaustion, they seemed to shine with intelligence and courage. "Your species is remarkable," Kresh said quietly. He was standing over them both, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't had before. "Not for your logic. Not for your military might or your technological advancement. You are remarkable for your willingness to trust the unexpected. For your ability to see value in something that doesn't fit your understanding. That is what makes humanity worth knowing." Jake looked up at the Velthor commander, and for the first time he felt like they truly understood each other. 6 weeks after the Krillian retreat, Jake Thompson stood in the Grand Coalition Hall and watched history being made. The hall itself was massive, a chamber carved from the heart of the Coalition's central station, with walls that seemed to stretch on forever. Representatives from dozens of species filled the space, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of the galaxy's diversity. There were tall beings and small ones, creatures with wings and creatures that moved on tentacles, entities that seemed almost made of light itself. But the two groups that mattered most were standing at opposite ends of the chamber. The Velthor delegation stood in perfect formation, Commander Kresh at the front, his blue-gray skin gleaming under the bright lights. Behind him were officers, scientists, and diplomats. They represented a civilization that had existed for thousands of years, that had dominated entire star systems through pure intellectual and military superiority. And facing them stood the human delegation. Not many of them, humanity was still young in the galactic community, still finding its footing among species that had been spacefaring for millennia. But they stood with pride, with dignity, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they belonged here. In the center, between the two delegations, stood the treaty document. It was displayed on a holographic platform, glowing with blue light, the words written in both Velthor script and human language. The treaty that would change everything. Jake wasn't part of either delegation officially. He stood off to the side watching. But he could feel the weight of what was happening. Every signature on that document was a commitment. Every word was a promise that two species, humans and Velthor, would work together, would build together, would face the future as partners rather than competitors. The ceremony was formal, structured, methodical. Representatives came forward one by one, adding their signatures and seals to the document. It took 2 hours. When it was finished, the room erupted in sound, cheers from the human side, a more measured but equally profound acknowledgement from the Velthor. These were species learning how to celebrate together. That evening there was a reception. Jake found himself being pulled from conversation to conversation, being introduced to important people, having his hand shaken by creatures whose appendages were completely different from human hands but whose gestures meant the same thing: respect, gratitude, partnership. 3 days later he got the call. "Director Thompson?" The voice came through his communication device, professional, formal. The Coalition Council would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Director. He still wasn't used to that title. A week after the treaty signing, Jake was called into a private meeting with the Coalition Council. They offered him a position that made his head spin. Director of Human-Alien Relations. A new department, newly created specifically because of the success of the Velthor partnership. He'd have a team of scientists, engineers, and diplomats reporting to him. His budget would be substantial. His authority would be real. Jake had accepted before they even finished explaining the details. Now, sitting in his new corner office on the highest level of the Coalition station, Jake still couldn't quite believe it was real. The office was large, larger than any space he'd ever had to himself, with windows that looked out across the docking bays and into the black of space beyond. His desk was a curved piece of material that seemed to glow softly from within. Everything about the space screamed power and importance. But the thing Jake was proudest of had nothing to do with the office itself. It was the logo. It hung on the wall opposite his desk, a symbol that represented the new partnership between humans and Velthor. The design was elegant and meaningful. On the left stood a human figure outlined in blue light. On the right stood a Velthor outlined in gold. And between them, standing on its hind legs with its wings partially spread, was a small dragon. The three figures were touching, connected, unified. The dragon was Ember. Everyone in the Coalition knew what that symbol meant now. It meant that the impossible was possible. It meant that different species, with different minds and different approaches to problems, could achieve things together that they never could alone. Ember wasn't just a mascot, she was the embodiment of everything the partnership stood for. Jake was pulled from his thoughts by a soft sound at his feet. Ember had woken up from her nap in the sunbeam that streamed through the window. The dragon stretched, her muscles extending, her wings unfurling and then folding back against her body. She blinked at Jake with those intelligent eyes and he smiled. "Good nap?" he asked, scratching under her chin the way she liked. Ember made a small trilling sound and curled back up on the cushioned bed Jake had placed in the sunny spot. She'd spent most of her time in this office since he'd taken the position. Other people came and went, meetings happened, decisions were made, but Ember was the constant. She was the presence that reminded everyone why they were here, why they were working together. A knock came at the door. "Come in," Jake called. Commander Kresh stepped through the entrance. The Velthor commander was dressed in formal attire now, a dark blue uniform with insignia that marked him as a senior diplomat rather than a military officer. He moved with the same controlled grace he always had, but something about his posture seemed different. Less rigid. More comfortable. "Thompson," Kresh said, approaching the desk. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never," Jake said, standing to greet him. They'd moved past the formal handshake stages weeks ago, but they still maintained professional boundaries. "What can I do for you?" "The Coalition wants to know if you would be willing to mentor a new generation of engineers," Kresh said. "Human and Velthor working together. We want to establish a formal training program where young minds from both species can learn from each other. Learn how to solve problems the way you do. With creativity and trust and willingness to see value in the unexpected." Jake felt something warm bloom in his chest. This was exactly the kind of work he wanted to be doing. "I'm interested. When would it start?" "As soon as possible," Kresh replied. "We already have volunteers. Eager young engineers, all of them. They're waiting to hear if you'll take them on." Jake looked down at Ember, who had opened one eye at the sound of Kresh's voice. She blinked slowly, a gesture of contentment and trust. "There's one condition," Jake said, meeting Kresh's black eyes. "She comes with me, Ember. She's part of this. She's part of everything we do now." Kresh made that almost smile, the one that had first appeared in the engineering section after they'd fixed the reactor. It was a small expression, but on the commander's angular face, it conveyed volumes. "Of course," Kresh said. "She is as much a part of this partnership as you are, Thompson. Perhaps even more so. After all, this entire alliance began because you were willing to bring a creature everyone thought was impossible. She represents the heart of what we're building here." They talked for another hour, discussing curriculum and logistics and the first cohort of students. When Kresh finally left, Jake stood at his window and looked out across the docking bays. Ships from both species were parked side by side. Human vessels, sleek and efficient, sitting next to Velthor craft, angular and powerful. Engineers from both species worked together on maintenance projects. Scientists moved between stations. The integration wasn't perfect. There were still cultural differences, still misunderstandings that needed to be worked through, but it was real. It was happening. Jake thought back to that moment in the sanctuary, when he'd stood in front of Ember's enclosure and made an impulsive decision that changed everything. He'd been desperate. He'd needed a companion for a diplomatic mission. He'd never imagined that bringing a cute dragon hatchling to a meeting would reshape the future of human-alien relations. Ember climbed onto the windowsill beside him, her small form silhouetted against the stars beyond. She looked out at the docking bays, at the partnership they'd helped create, at the future they'd all built together. "We did it, Ember," Jake said quietly, scratching her scales. "We actually did it." The dragon made that soft trilling sound again, a sound like contentment, like agreement, like pride. Outside, the coalition station hummed with the rhythm of two species learning to work as one. And it had all started because one human engineer had the wisdom, or maybe just the desperation, to trust the unexpected. Sometimes, Jake thought, the best solutions weren't the logical ones. Sometimes they were the ones that came from the heart, from intuition, from a willingness to see possibilities where others saw only problems. Sometimes they came with wings and scales and eyes that could see the world in ways no instrument ever could. The future, Jake Thompson was absolutely certain, was going to be incredible. And it had all started because he'd brought a cute dragon to a diplomatic meeting. The end.